The story of Catherine, who learns that her father is not who she thought he was, and searches for her real father after the death of Thomas. Catherine James lived her entire life in a small town near Springfield, Illinois. Her mother, Margaret James, died 5 years ago after a long battle with heart disease. After her mother's death, Catherine remained in the house, but for a long time she could not bring herself to even go into Margaret's bedroom. She locked the door and left the room the way her mother had left it on the last day of her life. Catherine worked at the local library, lived quietly and modestly, and did not have a wide circle of acquaintances. Her father, George, left the family when Catherine was 9 and never appeared again. Margaret never spoke of him, and all her daughter's questions were reduced to short answers. The topic of her father was not discussed in the house. Catherine's entire childhood was filled with school, books, and everyday worries, and her adult life consisted of work and supporting her sick mother. After the 5th anniversary of Margaret's death, Catherine decided it was time to open up her room. She gathered up the boxes for her belongings and moved into the bedroom. The air was musty, a thin layer of dust covered the furniture. Everything remained in its place on the dressing table: a comb, a bottle of perfume, a postcard, an old box of letters. In a drawer, she found notebooks and small notebooks, among which was one diary, wrapped in a leather cover with scuffs around the edges. Inside, on the first page, was her mother's name and the date 1984. At first, Catherine didn't plan to read the diary. She held it in her hands, then put it on the shelf and continued to sort through things. But at night she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts returned to the diary. Something compelled her to open it, as if it contained an answer she had never received. The next morning she sat down in the kitchen, made coffee, and opened the first page. The entries were clear, in her mother's neat handwriting. At first, Catherine found the usual daily notes, thoughts about work, everyday worries, mentions of the weather, trips to the store, visits to a friend. But gradually the tone of the diary changed. In one entry, Margaret mentioned a man named Thomas, a man Catherine had never heard of. She wrote that Thomas had only been in town for a few weeks, working temporarily on the construction of a new medical center, and that they had met by chance in a coffee shop. In subsequent entries, Thomas's name appeared more and more often. Margaret described their meetings, walks, conversations. She recalled that she had begun to feel with him, something she had not known in her marriage to George. There was a lot of sincerity and emotion in these lines that Catherine had never seen in her mother. The entries continued for several weeks. Then there was a sudden change. The entry for August 14th began with Thomas leaving only a note and a small gift. Margaret wrote that she did not judge him, because she had known from the beginning that he would not stay. But the same entry said that she suspected pregnancy. Catherine reread this paragraph several times. The date coincided with the period during which, as she had always been told, she had been conceived. Margaret did not mention George in her diary during this period. Then came the entries about doctor's appointments, test results, fear, indecision. Margaret described standing in front of the mirror and not knowing what to do. Then she mentioned that she had decided not to tell George because he had already disappeared from home for several weeks, and even if he had returned, she did not want to live with him anymore. A few pages later, Margaret wrote that George had returned when she was 3 months pregnant. He had suspected nothing, and she had made no attempt to explain. She had decided not to tell anyone the truth. When Catherine was born, George believed that the child was his. But Margaret wrote that she often looked at her daughter and saw in her the features of Thomas. Catherine put down her diary. Her hands were shaking. She got up from the table, walked around the kitchen, sat down again. Questions were swirling in her head. All her life she had thought of herself as George James's daughter. She had spent years trying to understand why he had left her, why he had never shown up, why he had never written. She had imagined him as a cruel man who had run away from responsibility. And now another version had emerged. Perhaps he had guessed that the child was not his. Or perhaps he simply did not want to be in the life of the woman who had betrayed him. Catherine decided to read the diary to the end. It was difficult for her, but she knew that she had to find out the truth to the end. Her childhood suddenly took on new colors. She remembered how her mother looked at her, how she sometimes hid in the room, as if she remembered something or was sad. Catherine had never paid attention to these little things, but now they became vivid in her memory. In the last entry for 1985, Margaret wrote that she made a promise to herself not to return to memories of Thomas anymore, and to live for the sake of the child. She wrote that she had to forget so as not to harm her daughter. But she kept this diary, and it seems that she could not throw it away even after years. The next day Catherine opened the diary again. She flipped through a few pages, skipping brief mentions of children's things, feedings, illnesses, walks. Margaret wrote not every day, but often enough to leave a trace of the events of the first years of Catherine's life. She described in detail her daughter's every step, every new sound, the first tooth, the first cough, the first word. In these notes, love and tenderness were felt, but pain, anxiety and loneliness also seeped through the lines. It was clear that Margaret did not share her burden with anyone. She lived with the truth, which she hid not only from her husband, but also from herself. Over time, new shades appeared in the notes. Margaret recalled that George began to come home less and less often, was late at work, sometimes did not stay the night. She wrote that she did not ask where he was going, because deep down she knew that this was the end. In one note, she noted that she felt relief when he was not at home. She was not angry with him, not jealous, not looking for explanations. She simply accepted his disappearance as a natural conclusion to everything that had happened. The diary further stated that she had seriously thought about changing her daughter's last name. But in the end, she left everything as it was. She explained that it was not fear or weakness, it was a choice for peace of mind. She did not want the child to feel that there was something wrong with her. She decided that it was better to live with the old surname than to give rise to unnecessary questions. In one of the next entries, Margaret confessed that she was afraid of Thomas's appearance. She did not know what to say to him. She wondered if he had remembered her, if he had ever thought that he had left something more than just a woman for a few weeks. She wrote that she sometimes looked for his name in newspapers, in lists, on posters, on bulletin boards. But she never came across a single mention. Then there was a break in the diary. Several dozen pages remained blank. Then a short entry appeared. Margaret wrote that for the first time in a long time she felt happy. She described how Catherine stood with the book in her hands, trying to read aloud, and how it moved her to tears. She felt that all the years of doubt and silence had been worth one such moment. Then came the notes related to upbringing. Margaret tried to give her daughter everything that she herself had been deprived of: education, support, peace. Catherine's whole life in her memories looked like a woman's continuous effort to protect her daughter from the truth. She did not take her to her grandparents, did not mention George's family, did not maintain any contact with his acquaintances. She isolated herself and the child to prevent any possibility of anyone finding out more than necessary. Later, Margaret tried to return to work, partially, for half a day. She would leave Catherine with a neighbor and return home with a feeling of guilt. She was constantly afraid that something would happen, that she would miss something. In one of her entries, she confessed that she constantly saw Thomas in her dreams, not as a lover, but as a shadow. A figure standing aside and looking at her silently. She did not know whether it was her conscience or just a fictional image that never left her alone. In subsequent entries in the diary, reflections appeared. Margaret began to write more about her inner reconciliation. She frankly admitted that she had made many mistakes, but believed that her choices were dictated not by selfishness, but by fear. She was afraid that the truth would break her daughter. She wrote that she planned to destroy the diary, but never did. Every year she remembered it, but put the notebook back in the drawer again. The last entry was short. Margaret wrote that time was passing, and she did not know how much longer she would live. She left these pages in case Catherine ever found them and was ready. She concluded by saying that she loved her daughter more than anything and had done everything she could to protect her, even if it meant living a lie. Catherine closed her diary and sat still for a long time. Her gaze was fixed on the window, but her thoughts were elsewhere. All her life she had believed one story of her origin, and now she was dealing with a completely different one. It didn't destroy her, but it made her see her mother in a completely different way. Every harsh advice, every silence, every avoidance of the subject, it all made sense now. Margaret had carried within her all her life the fear and pain that had prevented her from speaking out loud. Catherine stood up, picked up the diary, and put it back in the drawer. She didn't know if she would ever open it again, but now she understood, her life had not begun with the fictitious name in the father column, but with the moment when a woman named Margaret decided to become everything to her. Several days had passed since Catherine had read the diary. She hadn't returned to it. Hadn't told anyone about it, not even her closest friends. Fragments of what she had read were still spinning in her head, names, events, phrases. Her perception of her mother had changed. She no longer saw her simply as the strict, reserved woman who had raised her alone. Now she saw the figure of a mother who had made a difficult moral choice and had lived with the consequences all her life. Catherine began to recall episodes from her childhood. Moments that had once seemed strange or insignificant now took on new meaning. She remembered how once, in junior high school, she had brought home a school application form that required both parents' names. Margaret had told her to write only hers, without giving any explanation. At the time, it had seemed harsh. Now, it was a choice to protect. Another time, in her teens, Catherine had asked why they never had any photos of their father. Margaret had silently taken down a frame with one of her childhood photos from the wall and gone to her room. Catherine hadn't thought about it for years. Now she realized that this was the moment when her mother had once again felt everything she had been hiding. Opening an old box of things in the attic, Catherine found several envelopes with documents, old bills, postcards, recipes. In one of the envelopes was an old black and white photograph of two people against the backdrop of a hotel, somewhere in a resort town. The man was putting his arm around a young woman's shoulders. The face was not clearly visible, but Catherine understood, it was her mother with a man who was not George. On the back was the caption, Tom and Margaret. No more words. The photograph was crumpled, but neatly straightened. It had not been thrown away, it had not been torn. It had been kept. Her mother had kept it not for anyone else, for herself. Catherine put the photo back in the envelope and could not tear herself away from the thought, who was this Thomas? Catherine's attitude towards herself had also changed. All her life she had tried to live up to The expectations that her mother had formed. To be neat, correct, restrained. Not to argue. Not to explain, not to break the silence. Now she understood, her mother had raised her this way, not out of principle, but out of fear, the fear that any excessive openness or disobedience might lead her to the truth. Catherine felt that her personality was being formed under the influence of something she did not know about at the time. For several nights in a row she couldn't sleep. Questions swirled in her head that she couldn't answer. She didn't know if Thomas was still alive, if she had family on his side, if he had children, if he had mentioned Margaret, if he had suspected the existence of a daughter. She also didn't know whether to make a big deal out of it or leave the past alone. Finally, one morning she opened her laptop and typed in the name, Thomas R. Whitman. It was all she had from her diary. She didn't need much, just to see if anyone with that name existed, if there were any mentions, if there were any traces. The search engine returned dozens of options. Most were unrelated. A few were elderly men from the Midwest. One of them was listed as a former college professor in North Carolina. The photo was blurry, but there was something familiar about the look. She bookmarked the page, but she didn't write. She wasn't ready. The following week she went to the closet where her mother's things still hung. Margaret had died 2 years ago after an illness, and although Catherine had gone through most of the things, a few shelves had remained untouched. In one of the boxes she found another notebook, not a diary, but with individual notes. Among them was a list of things her mother had wanted to leave for her. It said, if Catherine ever finds out the truth, she should know that I never felt sorry for her. Then came an address, perhaps the last place Thomas had lived. That note changed everything. It was simple, but it had weight. For the first time, Catherine felt that her mother had foreseen this development. She had left no explanation. No letter, but she had given directions. She had not said to look, but she had not forbidden it either. And now the decision was Catherine's alone. That same evening she sat down at her computer again. She found the same profile, found the phone number in the public records section. She copied it into a notebook and stopped. She could have called. She could have written a letter. She could have left. But she did nothing. She just stared at the numbers as if they were encrypted with some new beginning. The night passed in thought. Catherine understood that every next step she took would change everything. She could find answers, but with them would come consequences. She didn't know if Thomas knew about her, or even remembered her mother. But she knew something else. She had a right to know. A right that had long slept under a layer of silence. Catherine woke up early. She couldn't concentrate on her work, couldn't think about her usual things. Her attention was completely focused on the address Margaret had left. She carried the notebook with her for several days, opening the page, looking at the words, closing it, and putting it back. She felt an inner tension, as if she were standing in front of a door that might hold the truth or nothing. One morning she packed her suitcase, booked a room at a small hotel near the town mentioned in the note, and set off. The journey took several hours. She didn't tell her friends or colleagues. She had to do it alone, without advice, without judgment. She arrived in a small town with a few streets, old buildings, a post office, and a library. Everything looked familiar and yet strange. She arrived at the address in her notebook. It was an ordinary house on a quiet street, with a neat lawn and a wooden porch. The mailbox said T. Whitman. The windows were closed. The curtains drawn. Catherine got out of the car, stood for a few minutes, and then got back in. She didn't dare knock. Instead, she simply sat across the street, watching. Over the next few days, she came to the house several times. She saw an elderly man come out in the morning, leisurely carrying the trash to the dumpster, checking the mail. His posture was straight, his walk confident, despite his age. He wore simple clothes, read the newspaper on the porch, occasionally said something to the neighbors. His life seemed ordinary. But Catherine saw more in him, a shadow of himself, echoes of his mother. Features that now seemed familiar. One day she went to the library. There was a friendly woman who worked there who said that the town was small, everyone knew everyone. When asked about Thomas Whitman, she replied that he had long since retired, had taught history at the local college, lived alone, had no children, and had never been married. Catherine did not ask unnecessary questions. She listened in silence, maintaining an outward calm. That evening she decided to write a letter. She sat down at the table in the hotel room, took out a piece of paper, and wrote a short message. She didn't mention anything personal. She introduced herself, said she wanted to talk, that she had found an address from her mother, who had known him in the past. She left her phone number without giving any details. She wasn't expecting much, but she wanted to make a move. The next morning she dropped the letter in the mailbox outside his house and left. She didn't know what would happen next, whether he would read it, whether he would reply, whether he would remember Margaret's name. She decided not to wait. She returned home that same day. Several days passed. The phone was silent. She almost convinced herself that there would be no answer. And suddenly an unknown number appeared on the screen. She answered. The man's voice was muffled but confident. He introduced himself, Thomas Whitman. He said he had received the letter. He asked if she was Margaret's daughter. And he was silent. Catherine confirmed. Thomas didn't speak for a long time. Then he said he didn't know. He said he remembered Margaret. He said he had been young, had made many mistakes, had left nothing behind but memories. He asked her if she wanted to meet. She agreed. They met a few days later at a cafe outside his town. Catherine arrived early, sat by the window. Thomas came in late, approached slowly. He was older than she had imagined, but there was something familiar in his eyes, the same concentration that Margaret had. They talked for a long time. Not about the past, but about simple things. He said he hadn't married because he had lost someone he couldn't hold on to. He hadn't known Margaret was pregnant. He had left then without saying goodbye. And he always regretted it. Catherine didn't blame him. She listened. She wanted to hear him. After the meeting, she didn't feel liberated, she didn't feel healed. But she felt the circle closing. She saw roots, not the ones she had expected, but the real ones. She returned home the next day. She never opened her diary again. Not because she had forgotten, but because she now knew enough. After meeting Thomas, a strange silence had come into Catherine's life. She couldn't call it peace, but she didn't feel anxious either. It was the emptiness after an emotional storm, when all the waves had subsided and the water had not yet become smooth. She was returning to her daily routine, but now everything was perceived differently. Everything that had once been unshakable, her understanding of family, her personal history, her relationships, now seemed shaky, changeable, subject to chance. Catherine decided not to break off contact with Thomas. She didn't know if she could call him her father, if he would want that role, but she didn't want to lose again the only living person who knew Margaret in a way that no one else did. They called each other periodically, exchanged short letters. Thomas sent her old college photos, clippings from student newspapers, pages from his personal diary, his own, which contained mentions of Margaret. He did not know that she had saved their moments. He thought everything had been erased. One day he sent her a small package. Inside was a small box, and inside was a pendant on a chain. Inside the pendant was a photo, black and white, with yellowed edges. Margaret, smiling, young, standing by a lake. On the back was the inscription, Summer 1985. The best day. Thomas wrote that he had kept this pendant in a drawer for almost 40 years, not having been able to wear it. Now he wanted it to belong to Catherine. When she held the pendant in her hands, it seemed to her that she had finally felt what had been missing all her life. It was not sentiment, not romance, not a memory. It was confirmation. She is not accidental. She is the result of a choice, of love, even if brief. She was not invented, hidden, or replaced. She was simply protected. It gave her an inner point of support that she had never had. From that time on, she began to change her life. She no longer avoided difficult questions. For the first time, she spoke openly with her friends about the past she had lived with. She told them about the diary, about the trip, about the meeting. She stopped being ashamed of not knowing the truth before. It was not her choice. But now she had the opportunity to build something new. She began to visit a group of people who were searching for or finding their biological parents in adulthood. The stories were different, some found, some lost, some were deceived. But they all went through the same process, the destruction of the old picture of the world and the formation of a new one. She felt among her own people. Meanwhile, her connection with Thomas had gradually deepened. They no longer talked about the past, but about the present. He talked about his life after college, about teaching, about friends who were no longer there, about the city where he had lived most of his life. She listened. She shared hers, about his childhood with his mother, about college, about his career. He didn't try to make up for lost time. He was simply there. One day he invited her to a family holiday, Thanksgiving, which he usually spent alone or with neighbors. She agreed. This time she came to town again, no longer with a heavy heart, but with warmth. She brought a pie, sat at the table next to him, helped set the table. They didn't call themselves family, but that didn't matter anymore. They were just together. After the holiday, Thomas showed her a box of old letters. Some of them had been written, but never sent. Among them were several addressed to Margaret. They dated from the period after their breakup. They had many doubts, many regrets. None of them mentioned a possible child. He really didn't know. But every letter was proof that he remembered. Catherine didn't take those letters. She left them for him. They were part of his story, not hers. But she remembered every word. Because those words confirmed everything was real. Even if short. Even if imperfect. Her life after that changed not from the outside, but from the inside. She stayed living in the same city, working at the same job. But confidence appeared in her eyes. That eternal question, who am I, disappeared from her gaze. She no longer felt like a stranger in her own story. She was a part of it. Finally. A year had passed since Catherine found the diary. During that time, her connection with Thomas had become permanent, almost habitual. They saw each other less often, but they continued to communicate, correspondence, phone calls, small gifts. Her life stabilized, and the memory of Margaret gradually took a new place, not as a lost landmark, but as part of a whole mosaic. Catherine began to write again notes, essays, thoughts. She thought about her story, not with pain, but with understanding. One spring day she received a letter. The envelope was unusual, official, with the seal of the local courthouse where Thomas lived. She opened the letter carefully. Inside was a short document signed by a notary. It said that Thomas Whitman had officially recognized Catherine as the heir to his estate, everything that had belonged to him at the time of his death. No emotion, just the facts. She was confused. They hadn't talked about it. She hadn't asked, hinted, or waited. She had called him right away, but he hadn't answered. She had left a message, no answer. A week had passed. Then she went back to town. The local authorities had confirmed to her that Thomas had died a stroke at home. A neighbor had found him 2 days later. The funeral was modest, without announcements. He had no family. The last entries in his notebook were a few days before his death. One of them was addressed to her. It was a short note: "You are the best thing that has happened to me since Margaret. I am glad I found out. I am sorry that I left like this. Thank you for being there for me." Catherine did not cry. She could not. It seemed to her that this end was already built into the very structure of their relationship. Thomas had come into her life to give an answer. And left when he could give nothing more. A few weeks later she arrived at Thomas's house with a lawyer to begin the process of arranging the estate. She went from room to room, opening drawers, touching books, rearranging things. Everything was as it had been since her last visit, as if time had stopped. In a small box hidden in a corner of the basement, she found another bundle of documents. It contained old notes, some photocopies, and a medical report. She did not immediately realize what she was reading. It was the result of a genetic test Thomas had done a few months before they had first met. Next to it was a sample he had sent to a private lab. And next to it was another report. The second sample was listed as Catherine. She was stunned. She had never given her DNA for any test. She didn't remember Thomas asking her to. And then she remembered, on one of their first visits, he had asked her to leave the cup she had been drinking tea from. He had cleaned it up himself. He had smiled and said he would put it in the dishwasher later. At the time, it had seemed like a small thing. She read the result. Incompatibility. 0% probability of biological paternity. She felt cold. She read it again. And again. Thomas was not her father. He had known from the beginning. Maybe from the moment he got the results. But he hadn't said it. He had accepted her. He had pretended. He had played. Or maybe he was living in an illusion that he allowed himself. And she lived with the thought that she had found the answer. There was another letter in the box. Handwritten, headed, "In case I don't have time to tell." In it, Thomas admitted that he had found out about the test but that he couldn't destroy what had already begun to build between them. He wrote that he wasn't her father by blood. But he was by choice. That he considered her family. That she had become everything he had never had in his life. That he wanted to be the person she was looking for even if it wasn't true. He didn't regret it. Catherine sat on the steps of his house for a long time. She didn't feel betrayed. She didn't feel angry. Only devastated. The whole journey she had taken, all the emotions, all the conversations, everything remained true, even if it was based on a mistake. And yet it wasn't the truth she was looking for. She realized that her story was incomplete. Thomas was just a stopover, not a destination. Once again, she didn't know who her mother really was. She was facing the unknown again. But this time, she was ready.